Can we go to that Lehman Brothers
Sure.
collapse moment? Because I think some US policymakers deep down blame the Brits for stopping Barclays taking over Lehman's, which I think would have made an enormous difference to the crisis. Do you
Well,
do that?
it was a crushing blow at the time because the British wouldn't allow Barclays to acquire Lehman. But a couple things. One is that I understand why the Chancellor didn't want to do it. He didn't want the bad assets of Lehman to end up on the British taxpayers' doorstep. And the other thing is, though we tried desperately to save Lehman, I think that even if we had saved it, something was going to fail eventually because Congress was not going to act until they saw, the consequences of a failure.
So there would have been some bigger crisis.
Eventually, I'm afraid, yes.
Yeah. In the book, actually, quite interesting, your political journey comes across. You start off, I think, as something of a kind of small government, instinctively small government Republican. You become persuaded that there is a role for government through the book. I think there's a bit where you talk about you have to stop people buying certain products like flammable pajamas for children.
Right.
And I don't think you had that view at the beginning. You thought there would be more personal responsibility. Just tell us about that journey.
Yeah, there was some movement, but I always took a moderate position. I think markets are very helpful in the economy, critical for a good economy, but the government has a role to play as well. What happened, though, is I think the party kind of left me because the Tea Party and the extremes of both left and right left me in the middle and many other Americans, I think, who would like to see a more balanced approach. And unfortunately, that's not where we are right now.
Right. So you call yourself a moderate independent, I think.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Who are you going to vote for in the presidential election?
I haven't voted. As a matter of principle, I didn't vote while I was chairman, so I don't even know if I'm registered. I'll have to check.
Right. You voted on interest rates, but not on
That's right.
president. A lot on the left look back at the last, I guess, 30 years of what they call the neoliberal consensus and neoliberal economics. And they see that as an ideological stance that the world took post-Thatcher, post-Reagan. Are they right to see it as ideological, or was it just technocrats doing their best for the world?
I think you need to look case by case. And in the case of the financial system, there was too much deregulation. The regulatory system, which was put together in the 1930s during the Great Depression, did not keep up with what happened, the innovations, the change. And so when the crisis came, we didn't have the tools, we didn't have the vision, couldn't see what was going on. So I'm not sure I would indict the entire philosophical approach. I think what we need to have is good, strong financial regulation, and that's what's happening now.
Right, we're getting there. What about on austerity? Because in the book and in subsequent interviews, you've criticised governments for pushing too hard on fiscal retrenchment, leaving a lot of pressure on you guys doing the monetary policy to kind of put your feet on the accelerator while the government's putting their feet on the brakes. Was that a bit ideological, do you think?
No, that's very practical. I think too much burden has been put on central banks to carry the recovery. The fiscal policy has focused too much on short-term cuts, short-term austerity. Long-term issues, yes, should be looked at, but when you have millions of unemployed, it's really not the time to be making sharp cuts, to be doing sequesters and fiscal cliffs and all the things that have happened in the U.S. Congress.
But what about in countries in Europe and the UK? Do you think governments move too fast on fiscal policy?
I do in many cases. I think, though, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, obviously, Greece is not going to do fiscal expansion, but a country like Germany does have some scope to do that.
And the UK specifically?
And the UK, I'm not an expert, but I think that UK was somewhere between the Europeans and the U.S. and has gotten a decent recovery, as you know. I think now the UK fiscal stance is kind of coming to a sort of neutral position, but it was a little tight earlier on and perhaps could have done better.
I mean, the reason I'm asking you, we've got this Charter for Budget Responsibility now, which is going to mandate a budget surplus in any normal circumstance. I'm wondering whether you would consider that fiscally responsible or fiscally irresponsible in making the life of central bankers harder.
It depends. If you're in a recession, if you're in a period of high unemployment, then I think you need to be prepared to have deficit in that situation, and understanding that in periods of rapid growth, you'll compensate for that. So I certainly wouldn't want to do that all the time.
But do you want a law that says you have to have a surplus except in these very predefined circumstances?
No, I wouldn't do that. I think that you want to have the flexibility to respond both to national emergencies or whatever might happen, always hard to define in advance, and in particular to respond to recessions as like the very deep one that we just, of course, have been coming out of.
When we look back at the crisis, clearly the public have been left quite angry, the sense that they picked up the bills and other people got away with it. Bluntly, do you think more bankers should have ended up in jail?
I think that the Department of Justice's strategy could have been more focused on individual responsibility. I mean, what they did was they fined big institutions billions of dollars, but that's the shareholders who are paying. What was the individual responsibility? I don't think we know the answer to your question because we didn't do the...
We didn't bother to look.
No,
No,
yeah,
no.
that was my concern.
Let's talk about the kind of policy regime. If you were writing a note and you're going to bury it, you're going to write it on vellum and you're going to bury it, and it's a letter to policymakers in 60 years' time, giving them the benefit of your advice, having been through this crisis and seen the build-up to it, what would be the pithy single piece of advice you would give to future policymakers?
I think I would say that when the situation is looking really benign, that's when the risks can be building, so you have to be quite vigilant.
And that was the story of the pre-crisis period.
That's a lot of what happened, yeah.
Yeah. Now, how do we get out of that hideous paradox? Because...
Vigilance. Vigilance. You know, if we look carefully and pay enough attention and make sure the system is strong enough, then we can withstand the periodic shocks that we get.
But you're a great fan of inflation targeting. We had inflation targeting. What we were looking for was inflation, and we didn't have inflation.
Right.
Meanwhile, Great Wolf had come in the back and eaten all the food and done a great deal of damage, which was financial instability. Would you now concede that you need a kind of financial instability remit in monetary policy as well as an inflation one?
For the central bank as opposed to monetary policy, because the Fed, for example, now has extensive resources devoted to monitoring the financial system, looking for risk, looking for problems. That's critical, but monetary policy doesn't have to do everything. I think that regulation, supervision, oversight, macroprudential policies is at least the first line of defense that you should take.
And 3 words, are we there now? Have we rectified all those problems?
We'll never completely rectify all the problems, but I think we have made a lot of progress.
Ben Bernanke, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.